I never thought that at 28, I'd feel so small, so unworthy, sitting in the living room of the woman who would one day be my mother-in-law. My name is Lila, and until that moment, I believed I had everything a young woman could want: love, ambition, and the illusion of acceptance. I had met Daniel 5 years earlier, during my second year at the university library, when he dropped a stack of books in front of me by accident, his nervous laugh filling the quiet room. There was something disarming about him, his honesty, his easy smile, and the way his hazel eyes seemed to see right through my walls. I'd fallen fast, a little too recklessly, and by the time I realized I loved him, he was already entwined in the fabric of my life. But meeting his mother, Marianne, changed everything. I remember the first time I walked through the grand doors of their Victorian home on the outskirts of town. The polished wood, the scent of lilies, and something more metallic I couldn't place, the soft hum of classical music filling the air. It all seemed carefully curated, designed to impress, to control. Marianne stood in the hallway, tall and elegant, with a posture that screamed perfection. Her hair was platinum blonde, perfectly styled, her eyes an icy blue that seemed to assess every fiber of my being in seconds. And when she spoke, her words were measured, almost rehearsed, yet carrying a weight that pressed down on me like a physical force. "You must be Lila," she said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Daniel has told us so much about you." I nodded, my stomach twisting. "It's so lovely to finally meet you, Mrs. Harrington." "Marianne," she corrected softly, as if we were already on first-name terms in a way I could never hope to be. That tiny correction, so casual, already made me feel like an intruder. Dinner that night was a tense dance. Marianne orchestrated every movement, every topic of conversation, while I tried desperately to find a foothold, a connection, anything to prove I belonged. Daniel, bless him, tried to shield me, to include me, but I could see the subtle warning in his eyes whenever Marianne's gaze swept over me, sharp as a knife. And then it happened, the whisper. We had moved to the living room after dinner, and Daniel had gone to fetch a bottle of wine from the kitchen. Marianne and I were alone for all of 3 minutes. I had no idea at the time that those minutes would echo in my memory for the rest of my life. She leaned close, so close that I could feel the warmth of her breath, and murmured in a tone that was all ice and silk. "You'll never be part of this family." Her words hit me like a physical blow. My throat went dry, and my hands clenched tightly in my lap. I wanted to scream, to demand why, but instead, I forced a polite smile, nodded, and whispered something meaningless. She straightened up, as though nothing had happened, and when Daniel returned, she greeted him with warmth and laughter, leaving me in a haze of humiliation and disbelief. I spent that night lying awake, turning her words over and over in my mind. Part of me wanted to believe it was a momentary lapse of judgment, a cruel test perhaps. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Marianne didn't like me. She would never like me. And no matter how many times Daniel assured me that she would come around, a part of me already knew that her disapproval was a permanent fixture, a shadow that would follow us through every family gathering, holiday, and milestone. I began to notice the small things almost immediately. The way she ignored my questions, the subtle sighs whenever I entered a room, the way she praised Daniel's ex-girlfriend from college when her name came up in conversation. Every gesture, every word, was calculated to remind me that I was, in her eyes, an outsider. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that she was protective of her son, that she was just wary, that love and acceptance sometimes take time. But the truth clawed at me relentlessly. She would never accept me, no matter what I did. The following months were a minefield of tension and quiet cruelty. Family dinners became exercises in endurance. Marianne's compliments were sparse, and when she did give them, I sensed the hesitation, the unwillingness to fully embrace me. I tried everything, bringing homemade desserts, asking her about her favorite books, listening intently to her stories, but nothing seemed to penetrate the invisible wall she had erected. And all the while, Daniel tried to reassure me, his frustration simmering beneath his gentle exterior. Don't let her get to you, he'd say, wrapping his arms around me after a particularly cold encounter. She doesn't know what she's talking about. You're my world, Lila. You know that, right? I clung to his words like a lifeline, but the doubt lingered. How could I fully believe in our love when the person who mattered most to him, who shaped his world, seemed determined to reject me at every turn? The more I tried, the more I felt like I was failing, not just at being his partner, but at being someone worthy of family, of love, of belonging. And then came the engagement. I had thought, naively, that announcing our plans to marry would change everything, that Marianne would see my devotion to her son and finally accept me. But I was wrong. The news was met with polite smiles and lukewarm congratulations. Behind those smiles, I could sense the judgment, the disbelief, the quiet whisper of disapproval. I suppose we'll see if she's really committed to this family, Marianne said, barely hiding the sneer as she handed me the engagement card. Her eyes, icy and unreadable, bored into mine. It was the first time I truly understood that acceptance is not something you can demand, earn, or negotiate. It is given freely, or it is withheld indefinitely. And in that moment, I realized that Marianne would never give it to me. She would never embrace me as her own, no matter how much I loved her son, no matter how much I sacrificed, no matter how patient or kind I tried to be. The days following the engagement were filled with a strange combination of excitement and dread. Daniel and I began planning our wedding, envisioning a future together, trying to create a bubble of love and happiness that Marianne's shadow couldn't penetrate. But the tension remained, subtle yet constant. Every interaction with her was a test of patience, a reminder of my outsider status. I began to second-guess myself, to question whether I could truly be part of a family that refused to accept me, or whether I was destined to live on the periphery, forever striving for approval that would never come. One evening, after a particularly strained dinner, I found myself alone in the garden, the scent of roses heavy in the air, and I allowed myself to cry. The tears weren't just for Marianne's cruelty. They were for the shattered illusions, the heartbreak of realizing that love, no matter how strong, cannot always conquer every obstacle. I felt a deep, gnawing ache, a sense of loss for the family I had imagined but would never have. And yet, beneath the sorrow, there was a flicker of determination. I realized that if acceptance from Marianne was never going to come, then I had to find a different path to belonging, not through her, but through my own strength and the love I shared with Daniel. I couldn't control her actions, but I could control my response. I could choose to let her bitterness define me, or I could rise above it, build my own sense of family, and claim my place in the world on my own terms. The next morning, the turning point came in a way I could never have predicted. I woke to the sound of the front door opening and closing, followed by hurried footsteps. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I wandered into the kitchen, only to find Marianne standing there, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. In that instant, the woman who had been an unshakable pillar of judgment and disdain the night before seemed human. Vulnerable, even. She began, her voice faltering. I didn't mean what I said last night. But before she could finish, I noticed the small envelope clutched in her hand. Inside was a note, written in Marianne's elegant, precise handwriting. The words hit me like a shockwave, a reluctant acknowledgement of my place, a grudging apology, and, most surprisingly, an invitation to breakfast, to conversation, to the possibility of a future where her hostility might soften. I didn't know how to feel. Relief? Suspicion? Confusion? Every fiber of my being screamed that this was too sudden, too convenient, too fragile. Yet something in her eyes told me that maybe, just maybe, the tide was beginning to turn. That perhaps the woman who had whispered words meant to wound me was capable of something else entirely, an opening, however small, for understanding, for acceptance, for connection. I took a deep breath, steadied my racing heart, and made a choice. I would accept the invitation. Not because Marianne had suddenly become kind, or because I needed her approval to validate my love for Daniel, but because I was ready to step into my own power, to navigate the complexities of family, loyalty, and love with courage and grace. That morning marked the first day of a journey I could never have predicted, a journey of pain, discovery, and the quiet, relentless strength that comes from refusing to be diminished by someone else's cruelty. It was the day I realized that belonging isn't given, it's claimed, nurtured, and sometimes fought for in silence. And as I prepared for that breakfast, the envelope warm in my hand, I felt a spark of hope ignite, fragile yet undeniable. I didn't know what Marianne's intentions were, or whether she would ever fully accept me. But for the first time, I felt a shift, not in her but in me. I was no longer the scared, unsure girl who had first stepped into her home. I was someone ready to meet hostility with courage, judgment with composure, and betrayal with clarity. And in that realization, I found the beginning of my strength, the quiet power that would carry me through whatever came next. Breakfast that morning felt like stepping into an unfamiliar world. The sun streamed weakly through the tall windows of Marianne's kitchen, casting golden rectangles across the polished hardwood floor. The scent of freshly baked croissants lingered in the air, sweet and warm, almost at odds with the knot of tension in my stomach. Marianne had prepared the table herself, carefully arranging plates, silverware, and tiny porcelain cups for tea. The effort should have been reassuring, but instead, it felt like a carefully staged scene, like a play in which I was expected to perform a role I had never rehearsed. I took a deep breath and sat down across from her, my hands wrapped around the warmth of my mug. Marianne's eyes, still icy, softened slightly, but the flicker was fleeting, like sunlight through moving clouds. She set a plate of croissants before me and said, carefully measured, "I thought we should start again. Just talk." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was heavy. I nodded, unsure whether I was supposed to respond with gratitude, relief, or suspicion. I had spent months tiptoeing around her moods, wondering what I had done to provoke her disdain, and now here she was, extending a fragile olive branch. It was disorienting. "Lila," she said finally, her fingers brushing the rim of her teacup, I spoke out of turn last night. You must understand, I've always been protective of Daniel. It's not easy for me to accept changes in our family. I could feel the old anger stirring, bitter and stubborn, but I forced myself to inhale slowly. I had learned, painfully, that reacting in anger only handed power back to people like Marianne. Instead, I said quietly, "I understand. I love Daniel, and I hope that matters more than my place in this family right now." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see her weighing my words. It was as if she was trying to read some hidden motive behind every syllable. But perhaps, for the first time, she encountered nothing but honesty. For hours we talked, tentatively at first, then more freely. Marianne spoke about her fears for Daniel, about the standards she had set for the people around him, about the life she had imagined for him before I ever existed. And I listened, sharing pieces of myself as carefully as I could, revealing the girl I had been before love, and pain shaped me into someone tougher, someone wary. There was a quiet exchange, not entirely trust, but recognition, an acknowledgement that we were both human, flawed, and perhaps capable of finding some middle ground. By the end of that morning, I felt exhausted and strangely buoyed. The tension hadn't vanished entirely, but the rigid barrier Marianne had erected had shifted ever so slightly. I left her kitchen with a cautious optimism, determined to keep showing her that I belonged, not just to Daniel, but to the life we were building together. But life, as it often does, doesn't allow such fragile hope to last unchallenged. Within days, the subtle battles began again. Marianne's approval was never consistent. It was a roller coaster of warmth and icy distance. One moment, she complimented the dinner I had prepared for Daniel, her words tinged with surprise. "This is impressive, Lila." The next, she would criticize my choice of flowers for the living room. "I don't think this color suits the space. Perhaps Daniel prefers something else." I realized that her disapproval wasn't always overt. It was threaded through everything, subtle and insidious. I began to notice the way she would corner Daniel after a conversation, her voice low and conspiratorial, whispering doubts about me that I could never hear. I saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes, the tightness in his jaw, when he defended me silently. It was a strange, complicated battlefield, one where the enemy wasn't obvious, where victory was measured in endurance and patience. I began documenting every interaction, not in a vengeful sense, but as a way to understand patterns, to protect myself emotionally. Marianne had a way of twisting situations to make me doubt my instincts, question my worth, and sometimes even feel guilty for existing. I would leave her house after these encounters feeling drained, my confidence eroded, my love for Daniel battling against the relentless scrutiny of his mother's piercing gaze. And yet, through all of this, I discovered a resilience within myself I hadn't fully acknowledged. I began to cultivate boundaries, not walls, but careful lines that allowed me to protect my heart while still engaging with the family I longed to be part of. I learned to accept that Marianne's approval might never come, and that my happiness couldn't depend entirely on her acknowledgement. The realization was liberating, painful, and empowering all at once. One evening, after a particularly tense family dinner, I walked home with Daniel in the crisp autumn air. Leaves crunched beneath our feet, and the street lamps cast soft halos around us. Daniel reached for my hand, his fingers interlacing with mine, grounding me. "I hate how she treats you," he said, voice low. "I hate that she makes you question yourself." I leaned my head against his shoulder, savoring the warmth of his presence. "I know, but I can't let her define me, Daniel. I love you. That's what matters. That's what I have to hold on to." He nodded, squeezing my hand. "I know, but it's hard to watch someone you love get hurt like this." "It is," I admitted. "But I also know I'm stronger than I think. I can handle her. I can handle all of it. I just need to remember that sometimes she's not the enemy, even when she feels like one." It was a fragile truth, one I repeated to myself like a mantra, and slowly, it began to stick. I started to notice small victories, a genuine smile from Mary, and when Daniel mentioned something I had done that delighted him, a fleeting compliment about my taste in home decor, reluctant acknowledgement of my presence at family gatherings. These moments were tiny, almost imperceptible, but to me, they were milestones, markers of progress in a battlefield where victories were rare and precious. Then one day, the unexpected happened. Daniel came home, his face alight with something I couldn't immediately recognize: pride, excitement, perhaps mischief. "You'll never believe what happened today," he said, tugging me toward the sofa. "Marianne, she asked me about the wedding guest list. She wants to help plan the seating arrangements." I froze, my mind racing. Marianne, the woman who had whispered venom in my ear, who had made me feel like an outsider, was now asking to be involved. I blinked, searching his eyes for signs of jest, but he was serious. "It's progress," I said slowly, my voice tentative. "Right?" Daniel nodded.
"Yes.
"It is. And I know it won't be easy, Lila. But it's a start." That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I reflected on the journey so far. Marianne's hostility had forced me to examine my own strength, my boundaries, and my capacity for patience. It had pushed me into moments of doubt and despair, yes, but it had also revealed an inner power I hadn't fully recognized. I realized that true belonging wasn't something granted by others. It was something you cultivated, protected, and defined for yourself. In the weeks that followed, I focused on nurturing that sense of self. I stopped seeking validation from Marianne, stopped measuring my worth against her approval, and began to embrace my own voice. I discovered that when I acted with honesty, kindness, and integrity, the fear of rejection lost its sting. And slowly, Marianne's behavior began to shift, not consistently, not without effort, but subtly, like cracks forming in a wall of ice. It was in those small shifts that I learned the most about resilience. I realized that people like Marianne often project their own fears and insecurities onto others. Her harshness wasn't a reflection of my inadequacy. It was a reflection of her control, her attachment to a vision of family that didn't include me. Understanding that didn't erase the hurt, but it gave me clarity. It gave me the power to respond with grace rather than fear, with patience rather than resentment. And so, I continued forward, step by step, encounter by encounter, finding ways to navigate the treacherous terrain of family dynamics while holding on to my love for Daniel. There were days when the wounds reopened, when her words or actions stung sharply, but I had learned to breathe through the pain, to remind myself of my worth, and to focus on the life I was building with the man I loved. By the end of part 2, I understood something fundamental. Marianne might never fully embrace me, but that didn't mean I had failed. Belonging, I realized, was not about unanimous approval. It was about carving out space for yourself, standing firm in your love and integrity, and refusing to let someone else's cruelty diminish your joy. And as I drifted asleep that night, wrapped in the warmth of Daniel's arms, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the icy walls Marianne had built could one day soften, and if they didn't, I knew I was strong enough to thrive anyway. It wasn't long before I realized that small victories, however encouraging, were fleeting in Marianne's world. Some days, she could smile warmly at me, share a laugh about Daniel's childhood stories, and make me feel, for a few precious moments, like I belonged. And the next day, she could glance at me with a thinly veiled expression of disdain, a whisper of judgment that reminded me that my place in her family was, in her eyes, provisional at best. It was exhausting, walking this tightrope of approval and rejection, and I began to wonder if patience alone was enough. Daniel was aware of my frustration. One afternoon, as we were packing invitations for the wedding, he noticed my hands trembling slightly as I arranged them. "Lila," he said gently, taking my hand in his, "you're doing more than anyone could ask. I know it's hard, but don't let her shake you. Not now, not ever." I nodded, appreciating his words, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking beneath the surface, something Marianne wasn't telling, something that might change everything. And soon enough, I discovered it. It was a rainy Saturday when Daniel's father, who lived quietly in the background of the family drama, invited me over for coffee. Mr. Harrington had always been kind, but reserved, polite but distant. I assumed it was just a casual catch-up until he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and said, "Lila, you need to know something about Marianne. Something she's kept from Daniel for years." My heart stopped. "What is it?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain calm, though the panic inside me felt suffocating. "She's controlling," he began slowly.
"She's always been that way."
"Not just with Daniel. With her friends, with her siblings. And she has a way of testing people, pushing them to their limits to see if they're worthy of her approval." I blinked, trying to process the words. It explained so much. The whispers, the icy looks, the subtle criticisms. Marianne's disapproval had never been about me personally. It was about control, about seeing if I could survive her scrutiny, whether I could remain steadfast under her gaze. It didn't make it hurt any less, but it gave context to the constant tension, the unpredictability of her moods. "She tests everyone this way?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes," Mr. Harrington replied, sighing. "But she doesn't always realize how much damage she does. You have to be careful, Lila. She's capable of manipulation, subtle, insidious. But she also respects strength. She respects someone who can hold their ground." His words struck a chord deep within me. Marianne wasn't an enemy to defeat. She wasn't someone to battle with petty arguments or harsh words. She was a challenge, a test of endurance, composure, and self-respect. And if I wanted to survive her world, to maintain my dignity and my love for Daniel, I had to find a way to navigate it with intelligence and poise. Over the next few weeks, I began to observe Marianne more closely, analyzing her patterns, noting when her mood shifted, how she responded to praise, how she tested me with subtle remarks meant to provoke doubt. I realized that every interaction was a puzzle, and solving it required strategy, not submission. I also discovered something else. Daniel, despite his love for me, wasn't fully aware of how calculated Marianne could be. He saw only the sharp edges, the small acts of cruelty, and he wanted to fix them, to mediate, to protect me. But some battles couldn't be fixed with words alone. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Marianne stopped by unannounced. I felt the familiar knot of tension twist in my stomach. She stood in the doorway, her posture impeccable, her expression unreadable. "I thought I'd help with dinner tonight," she said smoothly. I forced a smile, keeping my voice light. "Of course. That would be helpful." She moved around the kitchen with precise efficiency, chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, making small talk that seemed casual but was laced with scrutiny. I felt her eyes on me constantly, measuring, assessing, waiting for a misstep. And yet, this time, I didn't falter. I spoke confidently, handled the dishes with care, engaged in conversation without defensiveness. For the first time, I realized I could exist in her presence without shrinking, without begging for approval. "You've improved since the last time I cooked with Daniel," she said finally, a small, almost imperceptible nod accompanying her words. I didn't respond with praise or gratitude. Instead, I let the words settle, internalizing them as evidence of my own growth. It wasn't a compliment to manipulate me, it was acknowledgement that I had held my ground. Dinner that night was surprisingly pleasant. Marianne even offered a toast to Daniel and me, her eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment that carried neither judgment nor malice. It was tentative, yes, fragile, but it felt like a crack in the ice wall she had built around herself. Yet, I knew better than to mistake a single evening for a change of heart. Marianne's approval was a moving target, a shifting line I had to navigate carefully. I also knew that the deeper I allowed myself to care about her opinion, the more vulnerable I became. I couldn't let my desire for acceptance blind me to the reality of her character. As the wedding drew closer, the stakes grew higher. Invitations had to be sent, seating charts finalized, and family dynamics carefully managed. Marianne, ever the orchestrator, wanted control over every detail, from the flowers to the guest list, the table arrangements to the music. At times, it felt suffocating, as though she was trying to mold the event into her vision, erasing my presence in the process. But I discovered a subtle form of resistance, one that didn't involve confrontation or anger, but calm, deliberate assertion of my own agency. When Marianne suggested an arrangement I disliked, I spoke firmly yet politely, offering alternatives and explaining my reasoning. When she dismissed my ideas, I held my ground, refusing to let her undermine me with passive-aggressive remarks. I realized that maintaining composure, demonstrating competence, and showing unwavering love for Daniel were the tools I had to wield. Daniel noticed the shift. One night, as we lay in bed, he traced circles on my back and whispered, "You're amazing, Lila. I don't know how you do it, but I see you. I see everything you're handling, everything you're standing up to. And I love you more for it every day." His words warmed me, reminding me why I endured the constant scrutiny, why I navigated Marianne's subtle battles with patience and grace. It wasn't for her approval, it was for our life together, for the love that had survived every test, every whisper of doubt, every attempt to undermine us. Still, Marianne had her moments of sabotage. She would invite her friends over for tea when she knew I had commitments, question my tastes subtly during gatherings, and sometimes drop comments designed to make me doubt myself. Each time, I felt the sting, the familiar rush of anger and hurt, but I learned to pause, breathe, and respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. I also noticed another layer. Daniel's loyalty was unwavering, but he was human. He would argue, defend, and occasionally falter under his mother's influence. Witnessing those moments made me realize that our love was tested not just by external forces, but by the internal struggles we each carried. We had to learn to navigate the minefield together, to trust each other even when the world around us seemed determined to drive wedges between us. One afternoon, as I was organizing wedding favors, Marianne appeared with a subtle challenge. She placed a stack of invitations on the table, her eyes scanning mine. "I hope you've double-checked everything, Lila," she said, her tone light but loaded. It would be unfortunate if mistakes were made at such an important event. I met her gaze steadily. I have, Marianne. I've gone through them twice. Everything is correct. Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought I might see frustration or perhaps surprise. Instead, she said nothing, walked to the counter, and silently sorted through the invitations with me. The tension didn't vanish, but my response had shifted the balance. I was no longer a passive participant. I was asserting my place quietly, confidently, and without hostility. It was in these moments, subtle and quiet, that I began to understand something profound. Marianne's hostility was a test, yes, but it was also a mirror reflecting my own fears, insecurities, and resilience. Every encounter, every whispered insult, every sigh or judgmental glance revealed something about me: how I reacted, how I held my ground, how I claimed my space. I began to see that her power over me existed only insofar as I allowed it. By the time the wedding invitations were finalized, I felt a sense of quiet triumph. Not over Marianne, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the knowledge that I had endured, adapted, and remained true to myself. The whispers, the judgments, the icy stares, they no longer had the power to define me. I had learned to navigate the treacherous currents with poise, and in doing so, I discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. And yet, beneath the surface, the tension remained. Marianne had moments of warmth, yes, but her approval was inconsistent, a pendulum swinging unpredictably. I understood that this was her nature, her way of protecting her son, asserting control, and measuring those she deemed worthy. My task wasn't to change her. It was to understand, endure, and claim my place through persistence, integrity, and unwavering love. As I lay in bed each night, reflecting on the day's encounters, I realized that Marianne's whispered cruelty had been a catalyst, forcing me to confront my fears, sharpen my instincts, and embrace my own resilience. It had been painful, yes, but it had also been transformative. I was no longer the uncertain, eager-to-please girl who had first stepped into her home. I was someone who understood the complexities of power, family, and love, and who could navigate them without losing herself. And in that understanding, I found not just survival, but empowerment. I knew the road ahead would be challenging. Marianne's tests would continue, and the subtleties of her manipulations would never fully disappear. But I also knew something far more important. I was no longer at the mercy of her judgments. I was a participant in my own life, my own happiness, and my own love story. And that knowledge, fragile but unshakable, became the foundation for everything that would come next. The weeks leading up to the wedding felt like walking a tightrope stretched over a chasm I couldn't see the bottom of. Marianne's behavior was increasingly unpredictable, sometimes warm, sometimes icy, always poised to remind me that I was an outsider in a family I longed to belong to. Daniel, as usual, was caught in the middle, trying to shield me without igniting his mother's ire. I admired his efforts, but I began to realize that some battles couldn't be fought on his behalf. Some truths had to be faced directly, no matter how uncomfortable or painful. It was a Saturday evening, and the air was heavy with the scent of impending rain. I had come over to help Marianne finalize some wedding arrangements she insisted she wanted to handle personally. The invitation list was sprawled across the dining room table, envelopes stacked in precise columns, tiny sticky notes marking corrections and adjustments. Marianne was moving methodically, her eyes scanning every detail with the meticulousness of someone used to having control. I took a deep breath, summoning the patience I had cultivated over months of subtle hostilities. "Marianne," I said gently, "would it help if I double-checked the RSVP responses? That way we can be sure every detail is accurate before mailing them out." She looked up at me, her icy blue eyes assessing me in a way that made my heart skip. There was a long silence, and for a moment I feared she would dismiss me outright, as she had done so many times before. Then she nodded, ever so slightly. "Very well. But make sure you handle it carefully, Lila. These details matter." I smiled, inwardly celebrating the small victory. Handling the RSVPs felt like a quiet assertion of my place, a way to show competence without overtly challenging her authority. As I worked, I noticed Marianne lingering nearby, occasionally peering over my shoulder. Her presence was heavy, but I reminded myself to breathe, to remain composed. This was a test, no doubt, but one I was determined to pass. Hours passed in a tense rhythm of folded invitations, neatly written addresses, and Marianne's occasional corrections. By the time we were finished, the rain had started in earnest, tapping against the windows in a steady, insistent rhythm. Marianne finally set the last envelope down and regarded me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was neither approval nor condemnation, something in between, a quiet acknowledgement of effort and persistence. "Not bad," she said, her voice low and measured. "You've improved, Lila." I nodded, allowing myself a small, private smile. Progress, however tentative, was progress nonetheless. But no sooner had the words left her lips than the tension shifted again. Marianne's gaze hardened, and she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you truly think you understand Daniel? Do you truly know him, the way I do?" The question hit me like a sudden gust of wind, unsettling and unexpected. I met her eyes, steadying myself. "I know him better than anyone," I said softly. "I know who he is, and I love him. That's what matters to me." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Then she straightened, her expression returning to its usual composure. "We'll see," she said simply, as if the challenge had been issued and the test was ongoing. That night, as I walked home through the rain, I reflected on the encounter. Marianne's behavior was a constant oscillation between subtle warmth and deliberate provocation. Each interaction was a test of my patience, my composure, and my love for Daniel. I realized that if I was to survive this, I had to accept that some battles would be ongoing, that her approval might never be fully earned, and that my strength would be measured not by victory over her, but by my ability to maintain dignity in the face of hostility. The following week, the tension escalated in a way I hadn't anticipated. Daniel and I had planned a small gathering at his parents' house to finalize seating arrangements with family and close friends. Marianne insisted on hosting, of course, her every movement precise, her gaze sharp, her words carefully chosen. As the guests arrived, I noticed the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the way she scrutinized my interactions with the others, the faint edge in her compliments, the slight tightening of her jaw whenever I spoke. Throughout the evening, I focused on staying grounded, observing, listening, and maintaining composure. I reminded myself that my worth wasn't tied to Marianne's approval, that my love for Daniel and my integrity were what truly mattered. And yet, the tension was palpable, like a live wire crackling beneath the surface, threatening to spark at any moment. At one point, Marianne pulled me aside, her expression inscrutable. "Lila," she said quietly, "you must understand something. Daniel is my son. Everything I do for him. If you ever hurt him, I will not forgive it. You must remember that." Her words were sharp, a warning cloaked in concern. I met her gaze steadily. "I will never hurt him, Marianne," I said firmly. "I love him more than anything, and I will protect our life together." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded, as if weighing my sincerity. For the first time, I sensed a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, or recognition of my steadfastness. But just as quickly, her expression returned to its usual guarded composure, a reminder that her judgment was ongoing, conditional, and never fully predictable. The dinner ended without incident, but the subtle tensions lingered in my mind. I realized that Marianne's hostility, though exhausting, was also a catalyst for my growth. It forced me to examine my own strength, to cultivate patience, and to assert myself without aggression. It taught me that love isn't about avoiding conflict, it's about navigating it with integrity and resilience. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of wedding planning, I sat alone in my apartment, reflecting on the past months. Marianne's whispers, her subtle judgments, and her occasional warmth had shaped me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I felt a mixture of exhaustion, pride, and determination. I was no longer the unsure girl who had first stepped into her home. I had learned to navigate her world with grace, to hold my ground, and to maintain my dignity in the face of hostility. Daniel arrived later that night, sensing my mood without needing words. He wrapped me in his arms, holding me close as the weight of the week pressed down. "You're incredible," he whispered. "I don't know how you handle her, but I'm in awe of you." I leaned into him, letting his warmth soothe the ache of the day. "It's not easy," I admitted. "But I've learned a lot about her, about myself, about what I can endure, and about what I won't let anyone take from me." His fingers traced gentle patterns on my back. "We'll get through this," he said softly. "Together." And together we did. But the calm was temporary. Marianne's nature was not one to be subdued permanently by patience or reason. One afternoon, as I was reviewing floral arrangements for the wedding, she appeared unexpectedly, her expression unreadable. She held a small, delicate envelope in her hand. "I think you should see this," she said, placing it before me. Curious, I opened it, revealing a note from one of the wedding planners, an urgent message about a critical issue with the venue booking that required immediate attention. Marianne's eyes, cold and calculating, met mine. "I thought you should handle it," she said, almost casually. "It's important you know how to manage challenges." Her words were layered, practical advice wrapped in a subtle test. I felt the familiar rush of frustration, the old anger bubbling beneath the surface. But I reminded myself to breathe, to respond with clarity rather than emotion. I studied the note carefully, formulated a plan, and replied with calm competence, outlining the steps we needed to take to resolve the issue efficiently. Marianne observed silently, her expression neutral, as if evaluating my response. When I finished, she nodded ever so slightly, the tiniest acknowledgement of my capability. It wasn't praise, not exactly, but it was enough, a recognition that I could handle challenges, that I was not easily shaken, that my place in Daniel's life, and by extension in their family, was not easily undermined. That evening, I reflected on the subtle dance I had learned to perform. Marianne's tests were relentless, her scrutiny constant, but I had developed strategies to maintain composure, assert myself, and navigate her challenges without losing my dignity or compromising my love for Daniel. I realized that her resistance was not a reflection of my inadequacy, but a mirror of her own insecurities, her desire for control, and her fear of losing influence over the son she adored. And in that realization, I found a sense of power. Not over Marianne, not through confrontation or revenge, but through understanding, resilience, and the quiet assertion of my own worth. I knew that the road ahead would continue to be fraught with subtle battles, but I also knew that I had grown stronger, more capable, and more confident in my ability to navigate the complexities of family, love, and loyalty. By the time the sun set that evening, casting a warm golden glow across my apartment, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the kind that comes from knowing you have endured, adapted, and remained true to yourself in the face of relentless challenge. Marianne's whispers, her tests, and her subtle manipulations had shaped me, yes, but they had also revealed the depth of my own strength, patience, and determination. And as I closed my eyes that night, the weight of the past months settling around me like a protective blanket, I understood something essential. Belonging is not always granted by others. Sometimes it is claimed quietly, steadily, and with unwavering self-respect. And I had claimed it, not through confrontation, not through submission, but through the strength of my character, the depth of my love, and the courage to endure, persist, and remain true to myself. The wedding was approaching faster than I could fully process, and with it came an undeniable intensity in Marianne's behavior. It was as if the closer we came to the day that would symbolize my permanent integration into Daniel's life, the more determined she became to assert her influence. I had spent months learning to navigate her subtle tests, but now the stakes were unmistakably higher. Every interaction felt like walking through a minefield, where a single misstep could undo weeks of progress. It began one chilly Thursday morning. I arrived at Marianne's house to finalize the floral arrangements with her, hoping for a quiet, cooperative session. Instead, she greeted me with that familiar look, a mixture of scrutiny and faintly concealed disdain. The air in the room was tense, charged, as if we were both aware of the unspoken rules of this ongoing game. "Lila," she said, her voice measured, "I want to discuss the seating arrangements again. There have been some concerns raised by a few guests." I nodded, bracing myself. This was new. Marianne rarely admitted external pressure had any influence over her decisions. I followed her into the living room, where envelopes, place cards, and a meticulously drawn diagram of the dining room awaited. "Some of my friends," she continued, "feel certain family members should be closer together. They think it will create a better dynamic." I swallowed, feeling the familiar churn of tension in my stomach. Marianne was presenting this as if it were a practical concern, but I could feel the underlying challenge. It was a test of my patience, my diplomacy, my ability to navigate her subtle manipulations without losing composure. "I see," I said carefully, keeping my voice even. "We can consider their input. Perhaps we can make minor adjustments without disrupting the overall plan. That way, everyone feels included and comfortable." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as though analyzing not just my words, but the intention behind them. I could almost see the wheels turning in her mind, weighing my response, testing my capacity for tact. "Very well," she said finally. "Make the adjustments, but do so carefully. We don't want to create any conflicts." I nodded again, inwardly noting the victory. Marianne's acknowledgement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was progress. I had met her challenge without anger, without defensiveness, and with a level of grace I didn't always believe I possessed. That evening, I returned home, exhausted but quietly satisfied. Daniel noticed immediately the tension in my shoulders, the faint flush in my cheeks. "Everything okay?" he asked gently, taking my hand. I nodded, leaning against him.
Yes.
"It's Marianne. She's testing me again, but I handled it. And I think she respected it." He smiled, relief and admiration mixing in his expression. "I'm proud of you, Lila. You're incredible. I don't know how you do it, but I do know that I love you even more for it." Despite his reassurance, a lingering unease remained. Marianne's approval, even when granted, was never guaranteed to last. It was conditional, fleeting, and precarious. And yet, I had learned that my happiness, my sense of belonging, could not depend solely on her approval. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. I maintained composure in Marianne's presence, asserted my ideas politely yet firmly, and remained patient when subtle provocations arose. I noticed a change, small but significant. Marianne began consulting me more frequently, seeking my input on minor details, even asking my opinion on colors and layouts she might have dismissed before. It was not complete acceptance, not by a long shot, but it was a shift, a recognition that I was capable, competent, and unyielding in my love for Daniel. Then came the pivotal moment that would redefine the boundaries of our relationship. One evening, as Daniel and I were reviewing the final seating chart at Marianne's insistence, she pulled me aside with a serious expression I had rarely seen. "Lila," she said quietly, her tone unusually earnest, "I need to be honest with you. I've been hard on you, perhaps more than necessary. But you must understand, this family has certain expectations, certain traditions. I was worried that you might not fit." I met her gaze, surprised by the vulnerability beneath her usual armor. "Marianne, I understand," I said softly. "I know it hasn't been easy. But I love Daniel, and I respect this family. I want to belong, but I also need to be myself. That's who I am." She studied me for a long moment, and then, with a faint sigh, she nodded. "I see that now. You're strong, and you care for him deeply. That matters. More than you realize." Her words, tentative as they were, felt like a breakthrough, a crack in the icy wall she had maintained for months. And yet, I could sense the tension beneath the surface, the residual caution born of years of protecting her son, of controlling her environment, and of testing those who sought to be part of her life. The following week, a family dinner brought the ultimate challenge. Marianne had invited several extended relatives, some of whom were known for their sharp tongues and strong opinions. As the evening unfolded, I navigated each interaction carefully, aware that any misstep could be magnified, dissected, and used against me. And then, during the dessert course, it happened. A cousin, known for their passive-aggressive remarks, questioned the choice of my dress, implying that it didn't suit the family's taste. Marianne's eyes flicked to me, a subtle test, and I felt the familiar surge of anxiety. I took a deep breath, recalling the lessons I had learned over months of subtle warfare. I smiled politely, acknowledged the comment without defensiveness, and explained my choice with calm reasoning, highlighting the elegance and harmony of the design with the overall theme. Marianne's gaze softened ever so slightly, a fleeting acknowledgement that I had met the challenge with composure. The rest of the evening passed without incident, and as Daniel and I walked home through the crisp night air, he whispered, "You handled that beautifully. I'm amazed by your patience, your grace. You're extraordinary." I leaned into him, feeling both relief and pride. "It's not easy," I admitted. "But I've learned a lot about Marianne, about myself, about how to navigate challenges without losing who I am." Daniel held me close, his warmth grounding me. "We'll get through everything," he said softly.
Together.
And yet, I knew that this journey was far from over. Marianne's nature was persistent, her scrutiny ongoing, and her approval conditional. But I had discovered something powerful: my own resilience, my capacity for patience, and my ability to assert myself without aggression. These were tools far stronger than confrontation or revenge. They were the foundation of my strength, the armor that allowed me to endure without surrendering. The wedding day arrived, a swirl of colors, laughter, and nervous anticipation. Marianne was present, of course, her presence formidable, her expressions measured, her eyes constantly observing. As I moved through the day, engaging with family and friends, I felt a sense of quiet empowerment. I was not merely surviving her tests. I was thriving, asserting my place in Daniel's life and, by extension, in the family. And then, at the reception, Marianne approached me with a smile that was almost genuine, almost free of the usual tension. She handed me a small gift, a delicate bracelet, and said, "For you, Lila. A reminder that you belong here, in your own way." I accepted it, speechless for a moment, touched by the gesture. It was not total acceptance, not a surrender of all past grievances, but it was a recognition of my perseverance, my patience, and my unwavering love for Daniel. As the night unfolded, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The whispers of doubt, the subtle manipulations, the icy stares, and the tests of patience. I realized that the ultimate victory was not in defeating Marianne, not in earning her unconditional approval, but in discovering my own strength, resilience, and capacity for love. And as Daniel and I shared our first dance, surrounded by family, friends, and the warmth of a day that symbolized our unity, I understood something profound. Belonging is not always granted by others. Sometimes it is claimed quietly, steadily, and with unwavering self-respect. And I had claimed it, not through confrontation, not through submission, but through the strength of my character, the depth of my love, and the courage to endure, persist, and remain true to myself. That night, as we returned home, Marianne's words echoed softly in my mind. "You're strong, and you care for him deeply. That matters." They were words I would carry with me forever, not a declaration of complete acceptance, but a validation of the person I had become, the challenges I had overcome, and the life I had built with the man I loved. The weeks following the wedding were a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and subtle tension. The ceremony itself had been beautiful, filled with laughter, tears, and the rare, almost imperceptible approval of Marianne, but the aftermath revealed that the battles were far from over. The subtle dynamics, the quiet tests, and the lingering judgment still shaped our lives, like shadows stretching over everything we tried to build. I had learned to navigate the patterns, to respond with patience and grace, and to assert my presence without aggression. But now a new layer of challenge emerged. Marianne's expectations were not just about me. They were about Daniel, about her vision of family, about the fragile balance she sought to maintain in a world that was always shifting. And I realized that if I truly wanted to claim my place, I needed to confront the limits of her influence, without losing myself in the process. It began one Saturday morning. Daniel and I were having coffee in the sunlit kitchen of our apartment when he brought up a topic I had been avoiding, the upcoming family gathering, a post-wedding brunch Marianne insisted on hosting. "Lila," he said cautiously, "Mom wants to do it at her house. She says it's tradition, but I worry. I worry about the tension, about her trying to control everything again." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "We can handle it," I said softly, though the truth was that I felt a mixture of dread and determination. "But we need to set boundaries this time. I won't let her undermine us or make me doubt myself again." Daniel reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "I trust you. I know you'll handle it." The day arrived, crisp and golden, the kind of autumn morning that makes the world feel alive and vast. Marianne greeted us at the door, her posture perfect, her expression carefully measured. There was warmth in her smile, but beneath it lingered the familiar edge, the quiet assessment of my every move. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay grounded, and to hold my head high. I was no longer the girl who trembled under her gaze. I was someone who had endured months of subtle hostility and emerged stronger, more capable, more certain of her own worth. The brunch began smoothly enough. Guests arrived, laughter filled the rooms, and Marianne's meticulous attention to detail was on full display. She moved from table to table, ensuring everything was perfect, her eyes flicking toward me occasionally, testing, observing. I responded with calm competence, assisting guests, arranging dishes, and engaging in conversation with warmth and confidence. Each interaction felt like a small victory, a demonstration of my ability to navigate the world Marianne had constructed without losing myself. And then, inevitably, the challenge arose. Marianne approached me, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the ambient chatter. "Lila, I need to discuss the seating arrangements again. There are concerns from some family members." I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar rush of tension, the old anxiety threatening to resurface. But I reminded myself of everything I had learned: patience, composure, assertion. I met her gaze steadily. "Of course, Marianne. Let's review the adjustments together and ensure everyone feels comfortable while respecting the overall plan." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if measuring not just my words, but the strength behind them. For a long moment, silence stretched between us, heavy and charged. And then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "Very well," she said, her tone a mix of concession and evaluation. As I worked through the adjustments, I realized something profound. Marianne's tests, her subtle manipulations, her scrutiny, they were all part of a pattern, a reflection not of my inadequacy, but of her need for control. Understanding this shifted something inside me. I no longer felt the sting of personal failure. I felt the power of perspective, the ability to see clearly, to navigate challenges without losing myself. The brunch continued, and for the first time, I sensed a subtle shift in Marianne. She still observed, still tested, but there was a softness in her glance when she saw me interacting with family, handling situations with grace, and supporting Daniel. It wasn't full approval, not yet, but it was acknowledgement, recognition. And for the first time, I realized that Marianne's power over me was limited by my own strength, my patience, and my unwavering commitment to love and integrity. Later that afternoon, as the gathering wound down, Marianne approached me once more. "Lila," she said, her voice quieter this time, tinged with a vulnerability I had rarely seen. "You've handled yourself well today. I see the care you put into everything, and I see Daniel's happiness. That matters more than I expected." Her words were tentative, almost fragile, but they carried weight. It was not total acceptance, not a complete surrender of past grievances, but it was an acknowledgement that I had earned a place, not through confrontation, but through resilience, patience, and unwavering love. I met her gaze, offering a small, genuine smile. Thank you, Marianne. That means a lot. I love Daniel, and I respect this family. I hope that counts for something. She nodded, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between us. A fleeting truce, perhaps, but a significant one. It was the recognition that I was not merely a guest in their lives, not merely someone to be tested or judged, but a partner, a presence, and someone who had endured and persisted. That evening, as Daniel and I walked home, the autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet, he took my hand in his, a quiet question in his eyes. Do you feel like it's changing? Do you think she's starting to accept you? I paused, reflecting on the months of tension, the whispered judgments, the subtle tests, and the small victories that had accumulated over time. I think she's starting to see me, I said slowly. Not completely, not perfectly, but I see moments where she acknowledges me, recognizes my strength. That's enough. That's progress. Daniel smiled, relief and admiration mingling in his expression. I'm proud of you, Lila. Truly. You've navigated this with so much grace. I couldn't ask for anyone stronger by my side. And in that moment, I felt the culmination of everything I had endured, the whispers of doubt, the icy stares, the subtle provocations, and the tests of patience. I realized that the ultimate victory wasn't in defeating Marianne, not in earning complete approval, but in discovering my own resilience, maintaining my dignity, and asserting my place through quiet strength. The following days were a continuation of this delicate balance. Marianne's behavior remained unpredictable, but I had grown adept at navigating her subtle manipulations. I understood her patterns, anticipated her challenges, and responded with calm confidence. I realized that the power she once held over me had diminished, not because she had changed entirely, but because I had changed, grown, and embraced my own strength. And then, the final test arrived. Marianne approached me one evening, a rare vulnerability in her eyes, and handed me a small, carefully wrapped gift. For you, she said softly, a symbol of progress, of the place you've carved for yourself here. I unwrapped it to find a delicate necklace, simple but elegant, a piece of jewelry that felt personal, thoughtful, and meaningful. It wasn't just a gift, it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of my endurance, my patience, and my ability to navigate a world of subtle hostility without losing myself or my love for Daniel. I looked up at Marianne, seeing her in a new light. Not perfect, not fully changed, but human. Capable of warmth, capable of recognition, and capable of acknowledging strength when it appeared before her eyes. Thank you, Marianne, I said quietly, my voice steady and sincere. This means a lot. I appreciate it. She nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile crossing her lips. You've earned it, Lila. In your own way. As I wore the necklace in the days that followed, I felt a quiet sense of triumph, not loud or dramatic, but profound. It was the recognition that I had navigated months of tension, subtle hostility, and emotional complexity with grace, resilience, and unwavering love. I had maintained my dignity, asserted my presence, and carved a place for myself in Daniel's life and, by extension, in the family that had once seemed impenetrable. And as I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, I realized something essential. Belonging is not always granted by others. Sometimes, it is claimed quietly, steadily, and with unwavering self-respect. Sometimes, it is earned not through confrontation or submission, but through the strength of character, patience, and the courage to endure, persist, and remain true to oneself. By the end of Part 6, I understood that my relationship with Marianne would never be simple, nor would it always be free of tension. But I had discovered my own power, my capacity for resilience, and the ability to maintain my dignity in the face of challenge. And in that understanding, I found not just survival, but empowerment, a quiet, steady triumph that would sustain me for the rest of my life. The months that followed the wedding were quieter, yet charged with a subtle undercurrent that I had learned to navigate. Marianne's presence was no longer as imposing, her tests less frequent, and her remarks, though still measured, carried a new dimension, a hint of acknowledgement, a recognition of my resilience. I had earned her tentative respect, not through confrontation, not through submission, but through the steadfast assertion of my love, my patience, and my integrity. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was gradual, quiet, and almost imperceptible. But I noticed it in the small gestures, the way she consulted me about holiday plans, the way her critiques softened, the way she seemed to allow me space to exist in Daniel's world without constant scrutiny. Each instance was a small victory, a step toward a more balanced dynamic that had once seemed impossible. Daniel and I had grown closer than ever, our bond strengthened by the trials we had faced. The tension with his mother had forced us to communicate openly, to establish boundaries, and to support each other in ways that were deeply personal and profoundly grounding. I had learned to trust not only myself, but also the strength of our love, a love that had endured whispers, doubts, and subtle hostility, yet emerged resilient and steadfast. One afternoon, as autumn leaves swirled outside our apartment window, I received a call from Marianne. She asked if I could stop by her home to discuss family plans for the upcoming holiday. The invitation, while casual in tone, carried the weight of significance. It was an opportunity, perhaps, to further cement the fragile bridge we had been building over months of tension. I arrived to find Marianne in the kitchen, preparing tea, her movements precise and deliberate. There was a calmness in her demeanor that I hadn't seen in months. She greeted me with a faint, almost genuine smile. "Lila," she said, "thank you for coming. I thought we could go over the holiday plans together." I nodded, feeling a mixture of anticipation and resolve. "Of course, Marianne. I'd be happy to help." As we moved through the discussion, I noticed the subtle ways her demeanor had shifted. She listened attentively to my suggestions, asked questions about my ideas, and even smiled occasionally, a smile that was not forced, but tentative and sincere. It was a far cry from the scrutinizing gaze that had greeted me months earlier. During a pause in our conversation, Marianne set down her cup of tea and regarded me thoughtfully. "Lila," she began, her voice quiet but earnest, "I want to acknowledge something. You've handled everything with patience, with grace, and with strength. I didn't expect this. I didn't expect you to endure so much and remain yourself." Her words caught me off guard, not because they were compliments, but because they carried the weight of acknowledgement, a recognition of the challenges I had faced, the subtle hostility I had navigated, and the resilience I had demonstrated. I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet validation of a journey I had undertaken. "Thank you, Marianne," I said softly, my voice steady. "It's been challenging, yes, but I love Daniel. I love this family, and I've tried to navigate everything with integrity and care. That's all I could do." She nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting a mixture of respect and contemplation. "And that's what matters," she said. "I can see now that you're here to stay, not just as Daniel's partner, but as someone who contributes to this family in your own way. I can't say it hasn't been difficult for me, but I understand now." It was a turning point, not a dramatic reconciliation, not a complete erasure of past tensions, but a recognition that had eluded me for months. Marianne's acknowledgement wasn't a surrender of control or an admission of error. It was a quiet acceptance of my presence, my patience, and my strength. As the afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting golden light across the room, I realized something profound. Belonging, true belonging, was not about winning approval or erasing conflict. It was about claiming one's own space, maintaining integrity, and navigating challenges with resilience and patience. Marianne's recognition, though tentative, was a reflection not of my dependence on her, but of my steadfastness in the face of adversity. The days that followed were filled with a new equilibrium. Marianne's scrutiny was less frequent, her criticisms more measured, and her interactions with me tinged with a subtle warmth that had been absent before. She began including me in family decisions, seeking my input on holidays, gatherings, and celebrations, and even consulting me on matters that had once been strictly her domain. It was not total acceptance, but it was a bridge, a connection forged through resilience, patience, and unwavering commitment. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. One evening, as we prepared dinner together, he reached across the counter and took my hand. "Lila," he said, his eyes shining with admiration, "you've done something incredible. You've navigated months of subtle hostility, tests, and challenges, and you've emerged stronger, calmer, and remarkable. I'm proud of you. I love you more than ever." I squeezed his hand, feeling the depth of our bond, the strength of our shared journey, and the quiet triumph of enduring and persisting without losing myself. "Thank you, Daniel," I said softly. "It hasn't been easy, but I've learned so much, not just about Marianne, but about myself, our love, and the importance of patience and resilience." The culmination of these months of emotional endurance came during a quiet evening at Marianne's house. She had invited Daniel and me for tea, a simple gathering that carried layers of significance. As we sat together, the atmosphere was calm, warm, and surprisingly intimate. Marianne spoke of her past, her fears, and her own struggles in balancing family, control, and love. For the first time, she allowed herself to be vulnerable in a way that felt authentic, raw, and human. "I've always been protective," she admitted, her voice low and unguarded. Perhaps too protective. I wanted to control everything, to ensure Daniel's happiness, but I realize now that I can't control everything, or everyone. And I see that you've navigated all of this with patience and integrity. I respect that, Lila. Her words were not mere politeness or formality. They were genuine acknowledgement, the culmination of months of subtle tests, scrutiny, and endurance. I felt a profound sense of closure, not over the past, not over her past hostility, but over the journey I had undertaken, the resilience I had cultivated, and the strength I had claimed in asserting my presence and integrity. I responded with sincerity, feeling the quiet triumph that comes from facing adversity with patience and grace. "Thank you, Marianne. I respect you too. And I hope we can continue to build this family together with love, understanding, and mutual respect." She nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile crossing her lips. "I believe we can, Lila. I truly do." That night, as Daniel and I walked home under a sky streaked with stars, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The whispers of doubt, the icy stares, the subtle provocations, and the relentless tests. I realized that the ultimate victory had not been in defeating Marianne, not in earning unconditional approval, but in discovering my own resilience, maintaining my dignity, and asserting my presence through quiet strength. I had learned that love is not about avoiding conflict. It is about navigating it with patience, integrity, and unwavering commitment. I had learned that belonging is not always granted. Sometimes it is claimed quietly and steadily through the courage to endure, persist, and remain true to oneself. As Daniel wrapped his arm around my shoulder, I felt the weight of months of struggle lift, replaced by a quiet, steady empowerment. The tension that had once dominated our lives had not vanished entirely. Marianne's nature, her protective instincts, and her expectations would always exist. But I had discovered my own power, my capacity for resilience, and the ability to maintain my dignity in the face of challenge. And in that discovery, I found not just survival, but a profound sense of triumph. I had navigated the complexities of family, love, and loyalty without surrendering myself, and in doing so, I had carved a place for myself that was unshakable, earned through patience, courage, and unwavering integrity. As we reached our apartment, Daniel pulled me close, his voice low and tender. "You've done more than I could have ever imagined, Lila. You've endured, you've persisted, and you've emerged stronger. I love you, and I'm grateful every day for your strength." I smiled, feeling the depth of our bond, the culmination of our shared journey, and the quiet triumph of enduring without losing myself. "I love you too, Daniel," I whispered. And I know that together, we can face anything, challenges, tests, and all. And as we stood there, hand in hand, looking out over the city lights, I understood something essential: the power to belong, to be recognized, and to claim one's place in the world does not always come from others. Sometimes, it comes from within, from the courage to endure, the strength to persist, and the unwavering commitment to remain true to oneself. That night, I felt a profound sense of closure and empowerment. Marianne's whispered words, her tests, and her scrutiny had shaped me, yes, but they had also revealed the depth of my own strength, patience, and integrity. I had emerged not just as Daniel's partner, but as a woman who had claimed her place in the world through quiet resilience, unwavering love, and steadfast self-respect. And in that moment I knew, without doubt, that I had truly arrived, not by defeating anyone, not by seeking revenge, but by enduring, growing, and embracing.